January 12th, 1945. In a bunker beneath the Chancellery in Berlin, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel stood before a massive wall map, his face pale in the flickering light of oil lamps. Red pins marked German positions across the Eastern Front, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains. Black pins showed Soviet forces. The ratio was terrifying. For every red pin, there were 3 black ones. Keitel had been staring at this map for 20 minutes, trying to find something, anything, that might offer hope. There was nothing. Behind him, the door opened with a metallic screech. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armoured warfare, entered carrying a leather portfolio thick with intelligence reports. His boots echoed in the confined space as he approached the map. Neither man spoke immediately. They both knew why they were here. The reports Guderian carried contained the most comprehensive analysis of German military capacity ever compiled, and the conclusions were devastating. Guderian opened his portfolio and pulled out the first document. It was titled Assessment of Wehrmacht Strength, Eastern Front, January 1945. The numbers were stark. Germany had 2.3 million men facing 6.7 million Soviet soldiers. The disparity in equipment was even worse. The Soviets possessed 13,400 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany had 4,100. Soviet artillery numbered 20,130 pieces. German artillery totaled 8,200. In aircraft, the imbalance was catastrophic. The Red Air Force deployed 15,540 combat aircraft along the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe could muster perhaps 1,900, but raw numbers, devastating as they were, told only part of the story. The quality gap had become equally crushing. Soviet T-34 tanks now rolled off production lines in numbers that German intelligence found difficult to believe. 1,500 tanks per month from a single factory complex at Nizhny Tagil. Meanwhile, German tank production had collapsed to fewer than 300 vehicles monthly across all types. The panzer divisions that had conquered Poland and France now existed largely on paper, their strength measured in dozens of operational vehicles rather than hundreds. Keitel traced his finger along the front line, following the German positions from East Prussia down through Poland and into Hungary. The Wehrmacht held a front stretching nearly 1,200 miles. Defending such distances with available forces meant an average of 1 German soldier for every 2 meters of frontage. This wasn't a defensive line. It was a skeleton crew manning positions that could be overwhelmed at any point the Soviets chose to concentrate their forces. Guderian opened another report, this one detailing the condition of German units. The analysis was clinical in its precision and horrifying in its implications. Army Group Center, defending the approaches to Berlin, reported average company strength of 43 men. Full strength should have been 180. The 4th Panzer Army listed 27 operational tanks across 3 divisions. Those divisions should have fielded over 400 armoured vehicles combined. Individual unit reports painted an even bleaker picture. The 25th Panzer Grenadier Division reported to headquarters that it possessed 12 operational vehicles, including motorcycles and staff cars. Its artillery consisted of 4 guns, 2 of which lacked sufficient ammunition for sustained combat. The division's medical supplies had been exhausted in December. Wounded soldiers were being treated with improvised bandages torn from uniforms. Supply shortages had reached critical levels across every category of material. Ammunition stockpiles that should have contained millions of rounds held fewer than 100,000 shells for the entire Army Group Center. Fuel reserves designed to support mobile operations for 30 days contained enough gasoline for perhaps 3 days of limited movement. Winter clothing, essential for survival in January temperatures that regularly dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, simply didn't exist for thousands of soldiers. The personnel crisis extended far beyond mere numbers. Guderian's reports documented the systematic collapse of German military leadership at every level. Experienced officers, the backbone of Wehrmacht effectiveness, had been killed or wounded at catastrophic rates. Regiment commanders with 5 years of combat experience were being replaced by lieutenants with 5 months of training. Battalion leaders who understood combined arms tactics had been replaced by sergeants who had never commanded more than a squad. Training standards for replacement troops had deteriorated beyond recognition. New soldiers arriving at the front had received perhaps 6 weeks of basic instruction compared to the 6-month standard in 1941. Many couldn't properly operate their weapons. Some had never thrown a live grenade before reaching combat units. Others had fired fewer than 50 practice rounds before being handed rifles and sent to face Soviet veterans who had been fighting continuously for 3 years. The age composition of German forces revealed another dimension of the crisis. Units that should have been manned by soldiers in their early 20s now consisted largely of teenagers and men over 40. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division reported that 60% of its personnel were either under 18 or over 35 years old. Physical fitness standards had been abandoned. Men who couldn't march 20 kilometers with full equipment were being assigned to infantry companies that might need to retreat 50 kilometers on foot while carrying wounded comrades. Keitel examined intelligence assessments of Soviet capabilities. The reports made clear that while German strength had collapsed, Soviet power had grown exponentially. Stalin's industrial machine, relocated beyond the Ural Mountains in 1941, now outproduced German factories by margins that seemed impossible. Monthly Soviet tank production exceeded total German output for the entire year of 1944. Aircraft rolling off Soviet assembly lines numbered in the thousands while German production struggled to replace daily losses. Soviet tactical doctrine had evolved through 4 years of continuous warfare. Early war reports described Red Army attacks as crude frontal assaults that relied on overwhelming numbers to compensate for poor coordination. Current intelligence painted a different picture. Soviet commanders now demonstrated sophisticated understanding of combined arms operations. Their artillery preparation was mathematically precise, concentrating firepower to obliterate specific defensive sectors. Infantry and armor coordination had achieved levels that German observers found professionally impressive, despite their devastating implications. The quality of Soviet equipment had improved dramatically. Early war T-34 tanks had been mechanically unreliable and poorly equipped with radio communications. Current models incorporated design improvements that addressed previous weaknesses. Soviet artillery now included heavy guns that outranged German counterparts. Small arms were rugged, simple, and produced in quantities that allowed every soldier to carry hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Intelligence reports detailed the scale of Soviet logistical preparation for upcoming offensives. Reconnaissance flights revealed massive supply depots being constructed behind Soviet lines. Ammunition dumps covered areas measured in square kilometers. Fuel storage facilities contained millions of gallons of gasoline. Medical facilities had been expanded to handle casualties from operations involving millions of soldiers. The Soviets weren't preparing for limited attacks. They were organizing campaigns designed to destroy entire army groups. German intelligence estimates projected Soviet offensive capabilities for early 1945. The analysis concluded that Stalin possessed sufficient forces to launch simultaneous attacks across multiple sectors of the Eastern Front. These wouldn't be probing attacks or limited objectives operations. Soviet force concentrations suggested preparation for breakthrough attempts designed to shatter German defensive positions and advance hundreds of kilometers before German reserves could respond. The problem was that German reserves barely existed. Guderian closed his portfolio and looked at Keitel. Both men understood what these reports meant. The Wehrmacht no longer possessed the strength to defend the territory it occupied. Every defensive position could be overwhelmed by concentrated Soviet attacks. Every German withdrawal would expose neighboring units to encirclement. The mathematics of warfare had turned decisively against Germany, and no amount of tactical skill or fighting spirit could compensate for such overwhelming material disadvantage. The moment of reckoning was approaching. Within days, Soviet forces would launch offensives that would test every weakness documented in these intelligence reports. German positions that looked formidable on maps would crumble under bombardments they couldn't answer. Units that appeared capable of resistance would dissolve when attacked by forces they couldn't match. The Eastern Front, stretched beyond its breaking point, was about to snap. About to snap. The intelligence reports contained one final section that Guderian had hesitated to show Keitel. It was marked Most Secret and dealt with German defensive preparations, or, more accurately, the complete absence of meaningful defensive preparations. The Atlantic Wall had consumed enormous resources and manpower, creating the illusion of impregnable fortifications along the French coast. But the Eastern Front, where the war would actually be decided, had no equivalent defensive system. German engineering units had spent 3 years building elaborate bunker complexes in France that would be bypassed in a matter of days after D-Day. Meanwhile, the approaches to Berlin remained virtually unfortified. There were no tank barriers, no prepared artillery positions, no interconnected strongpoints that could channel Soviet attacks into killing zones. The defensive line existed primarily as marks on maps rather than physical obstacles that could slow enemy advances. Construction of defensive positions required materials that Germany no longer possessed in sufficient quantities. Steel for tank barriers had been diverted to submarine production. Concrete for bunkers was needed for V-2 rocket facilities. Engineering equipment for digging anti-tank ditches had been lost during the retreats of 1943 and 1944. Even basic tools, like shovels and picks, were in short supply. German soldiers, attempting to prepare defensive positions, were using improvised tools fashioned from scrap metal and broken equipment. The few defensive works that had been constructed revealed the desperation of Germany's situation. Anti-tank obstacles consisted of overturned civilian automobiles weighted down with rubble. Artillery positions were holes in the ground, covered with boards and camouflage netting that wouldn't stop rifle bullets, much less artillery shells. Command bunkers were basements of destroyed buildings reinforced with whatever materials could be scavenged from nearby ruins. Communications systems that should have connected defensive positions across hundreds of kilometers of front lines simply didn't exist. Radio equipment was obsolete, unreliable, and insufficient in quantity. Telephone lines had been repeatedly cut by partisan attacks and couldn't be properly repaired due to material shortages. Many units would enter combat with no means of communicating with higher headquarters or neighboring formations. Coordination between different defensive sectors would be impossible once fighting began. Keitel examined reports from Army Group North defending East Prussia. The situation there encapsulated everything wrong with German defensive preparations. The Army Group occupied positions that had been selected for political rather than military reasons. Hitler had insisted that East Prussia, the heartland of Prussian military tradition, must be defended regardless of tactical considerations. This meant German forces were deployed in a salient that projected deep into Soviet-held territory, surrounded on 3 sides by enemy forces. The defensive positions in East Prussia violated every principle of sound military engineering. They were too far forward, making them vulnerable to encirclement. They lacked depth, meaning a single breakthrough could collapse the entire defensive system. They were poorly sighted, often in low ground that gave attacking forces observation advantages. Most critically, they had no prepared fallback positions, meaning any withdrawal would become a disorganized retreat. Army Group Center faced similar problems defending the direct approaches to Berlin. The front line ran through terrain that favored attacking forces. Wide, flat plains provided perfect conditions for mass tank attacks. Rivers that should have formed natural defensive barriers had frozen solid, allowing Soviet forces to cross at any point. Forests that might have channeled attacks into narrow corridors had been cleared by years of combat, creating open ground ideal for Soviet combined arms operations. The German forces defending these inadequate positions were themselves inadequately prepared for the battles they would face. Training in defensive tactics had been minimal. Most German officers had learned warfare during the victorious offensive campaigns of 1940 and 1941. They understood how to attack, but defending against overwhelming enemy superiority required different skills that few possessed. Improvised defensive techniques developed during the retreats of 1943 and 1944 had never been systematized or taught to newly assigned officers. Individual soldiers lacked the equipment necessary for effective defensive combat. Anti-tank weapons were scarce and often ineffective against modern Soviet armor. The Panzerfaust, Germany's primary infantry anti-tank weapon, had a maximum range of 30 meters and required soldiers to allow enemy tanks to approach almost close enough to touch before engaging. Machine guns that should have provided the backbone of defensive firepower were worn out from years of use and couldn't be properly maintained due to parts shortages. Medical preparations for the coming battles were virtually non-existent. Field hospitals had been repeatedly overrun during previous retreats, and their equipment lost. Medical supplies that should have been stockpiled near defensive positions had been consumed treating casualties from ongoing combat. Evacuation procedures for wounded soldiers hadn't been established because there were insufficient vehicles for transportation and insufficient facilities for treatment. The reports documented systematic failures in every aspect of military preparation. Intelligence gathering had broken down due to lack of reconnaissance aircraft and communication equipment. Weather forecasting was impossible without meteorological instruments. Map supplies were inadequate, with many units possessing only sketch maps of the areas they were supposed to defend. Artillery survey equipment needed for accurate fire control had been destroyed or abandoned during previous withdrawals. Guderian pointed to specific examples that illustrated the scope of the crisis. The 6th Panzer Division reported that it possessed 3 operational tanks, 2 of which had mechanical problems that made them unreliable for combat. The division's artillery consisted of a single howitzer with 17 rounds of ammunition. Its infantry component numbered fewer than 400 men, less than the strength of a single full-strength battalion. This formation was expected to defend a sector of front line measuring 15 kilometers in width. Similar conditions existed throughout the Wehrmacht. The 18th Panzergrenadier Division listed its combat strength as 180 men, equipped with small arms only. No heavy weapons, no vehicles, no communications equipment beyond a single field telephone with damaged wire that might or might not connect to headquarters. The 24th Panzer Division existed only as a headquarters staff, commanding no actual combat units. Its tanks, artillery, and infantry had been destroyed or transferred to other formations months earlier. Supply calculations revealed the impossibility of sustaining defensive operations, even if German forces could initially resist Soviet attacks. Ammunition consumption during intensive combat typically exceeded 1,000 rounds per rifle per day. German stockpiles contained fewer than 100 rounds per rifle across entire army groups. Artillery pieces required hundreds of shells daily to provide effective defensive support. Available artillery ammunition wouldn't support intensive combat for more than a few hours. Fuel shortages meant that even operational vehicles couldn't be effectively employed. Tanks that might have provided mobile defensive support had fuel for perhaps 10 kilometers of movement. Artillery pieces that could have been repositioned to meet changing tactical situations would remain fixed in their initial positions, regardless of battlefield developments. Supply trucks that should have delivered ammunition and food to forward positions lacked gasoline for even local distribution missions. The human cost of these material shortages was already becoming apparent in daily casualty reports. Soldiers were developing frostbite because they lacked adequate winter clothing. Malnutrition was weakening resistance to disease and reducing physical capability for combat operations. Exhaustion from prolonged combat without adequate rest was causing mental breakdowns that removed experienced personnel from combat units at rates that replacement training couldn't match. German intelligence had intercepted Soviet communications that revealed the enemy's awareness of Wehrmacht weaknesses. Soviet commanders were planning operations specifically designed to exploit known German vulnerabilities. They understood that German forces lacked mobility for rapid redeployment. They recognized that German artillery couldn't provide sustained fire support. They knew that German reserves were insufficient to reinforce threatened sectors. The intercepted communications revealed Soviet confidence that upcoming offensives would achieve decisive results. Soviet generals discussed breakthrough operations in terms of days rather than weeks. They planned exploitation phases that would advance hundreds of kilometers before German forces could organize coherent resistance. They anticipated capturing entire German army groups through encirclement operations that would prevent organized withdrawal. Keitel and Guderian had reached the same inevitable conclusion that their intelligence reports documented with mathematical precision. The Eastern Front was about to collapse not through any single catastrophic battle, but through the accumulated weight of overwhelming enemy superiority in every category of military capability. German defensive positions would be overwhelmed by artillery bombardments they couldn't answer. German infantry would be overrun by tank attacks they couldn't stop. German reserves would be encircled by mobile operations they couldn't match. The moment when these calculations would be tested against reality was approaching rapidly. Soviet forces were completing their preparations for offensives that would begin within days. German positions that appeared stable on headquarters maps would dissolve under attacks that would expose every weakness these intelligence reports had identified. The Wehrmacht's ability to defend the territory it occupied was about to be tested against an enemy that possessed every advantage except time. Time. January 12th, 1945, marked more than just another day of wartime planning in a Berlin bunker. It represented the moment when mathematical reality finally overwhelmed ideological fantasy. Keitel and Guderian weren't just examining intelligence reports that evening. They were witnessing the precise instant when German military power crossed the threshold from weakness into total collapse. The numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could obscure. 3 Soviet soldiers for every German, 3 Soviet tanks for every Wehrmacht armored vehicle, 8 Soviet aircraft for every Luftwaffe fighter. These weren't just statistics. They were the mathematical expression of industrial capacity, training systems, and logistical networks that had been building toward this moment for 4 years. Within weeks, these calculations would be tested in the crucible of actual combat. The Vistula-Oder offensive would shatter Army Group A in 5 days. The East Prussian offensive would destroy Army Group Center in 3 weeks. The numbers that looked so stark in those intelligence reports would prove, if anything, to be conservative estimates of Soviet superiority. The Eastern Front's collapse wasn't caused by any single tactical failure or strategic miscalculation. It was the inevitable result of a war machine that had consumed its own capacity for regeneration. Germany had built a military designed for short, decisive campaigns. When forced into prolonged attrition warfare, that same military devoured itself, burning through experienced personnel, irreplaceable equipment, and finite resources until nothing remained but the mathematical certainty of defeat. History would remember 1945 as the year Germany surrendered. But for those who understood the true condition of Wehrmacht forces in January, the war had already ended in that Berlin bunker. In the moment when 2 generals closed their intelligence portfolios and acknowledged what the numbers had been telling them all along.